So, good evening to everyone joining us here in person at Abbey House in Durham, and to those of you joining us online to this hybrid International Center for Moral Injury lecture and webinar. My name is Brian Powers, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury, or the ICMI as we often call it. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to the conversation, as well as to welcome Reverend Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock for a discussion titled Rising Fascism and Threats to Democracy, the Role of Moral Injury. I'll introduce Rita shortly, and I don't want to belabor you with opening remarks, but let me simply note the International Center for Moral Injury is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. So without further ado, then, let me introduce our guest this evening, scholar, educator, editor, mentor to women of color scholars, award-winning author, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock is a recognized expert on moral injury. She co-founded and directed the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School from 2012 to 2017. And from 2017 to 2025, she was Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Recovery Programs at Volunteers of America, a large social services nonprofit. The educational programs she created at VOA are now being offered via the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School. She lives in Minnesota, formerly the lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. Is that how I say it?
Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe, thank you. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and it's an honor to welcome my friend, colleague, and generous mentor, Rita Nakashima Brock.
Thank you. Bye. So I didn't really anticipate when I started working on moral injury 15 years ago, which was mostly with military veterans, that it would wind up being really helpful, I think, to understanding what's happening in the United States right now. And I think there are dimensions of moral injury that are kind of coalescing and intersecting right now. And it's sort of interesting to be in that space of thinking about it right at this moment. And for those of you that don't know what moral injury means, which is most people because it's a relatively new term, it's basically the basic fact that as a human species, we're born to need love and care from the minute we leave the womb. We can't survive on our own. We're not like some baby animals that sort of do fine when they're born and like chickens and peck around and get sort of make it on their own. We actually are quite dependent on love and care for a long time to develop intelligence, language, and all those sorts of things.
Humans orient to being good, to receive the love needed to flourish, and we imprint on the behaviors of those closest to us to learn how to be moral, mostly as habit. Moral judgment emerges with brain maturation, language, and conscience formation. Moral conflict is an ordinary response of conscience when something goes wrong and harm results. When the harm is profound, sustained, deliberately inflicted, and/or systemic, it can challenge our very sense of self and our meaning system and result in a spiritual crisis for individuals, institutions, and communities. Inflicting, failing to prevent, witnessing, inheriting, or being victimized by profound harm can result in feelings of outrage, aggrieved victim anger, despair, shame, remorse, disgust, hatred of self or other, and suicidality. Historical legacies of moral injury that are unaddressed can endure for generations.
So that sense of feeling horrible about who you are as a human being is a common human condition. It isn't that you're mentally ill, you're actually responding to a real bad thing. And that real bad thing can be an incident, just something like even a car accident if you kill somebody accidentally, or it can be a sustained life condition like poverty, where you can't do the right thing. You have to choose between medicine and rent. Things like that. Those are all conditions that cause people to feel horrible moral qualms in their conscience, and they can lose confidence in who they are. They can wonder, who am I now? Or they can give up on life, or they can get really, really angry that the reality in front of them isn't cooperating with what they think is right, and that their life expectations aren't being met. So I think part of what we're facing in the United States is a very long history in the American South of the Civil War and then racism and all those things that you read about in the history of the Civil Rights Movement, where the whole point of the South owning slaves was it was their livelihood, the cotton crops and all of that. And then when that went away, there was a lot of poverty that came from that, and people had to figure out how to recover. And they racism in the South, with that anger about their life condition, was often visited upon African Americans. And I think right now we're facing a kind of condition amongst men, especially white men in American society, that comes from the kind of implicit expectations in life that they have, that they will be able to find a job and raise a family and have a good life. And that has been eroding. That set of expectations has been much more difficult for white men to achieve, especially in the South and in rural areas of the United States, because since Ronald Reagan was elected, there's been a transfer of wealth from the middle class, a huge transfer of wealth from the middle class to the rich. That has to do with the way the tax codes and economic systems got changed. And so if you're a white male in Alabama or Wyoming or someplace like that, and your father had a really good union job or had a ranch or whatever, you might not yourself be able to live that life because of the current conditions in the country economically. And so then your life expectations are not met. And you may be trying as hard as possible to do your best, and you can't get ahead. So the options for people in those places has been to enlist in the military, where you can actually go to college on the GI Bill. We don't have free college in the United States. In fact, most middle-class people can't afford college in the United States. It's too expensive. So that was one way people could get ahead. But even then, if you go back home, finding a job that meets your life expectations and be able to build the life you expect of yourself may not be possible. And when the insurrection in Washington, D.C. happened, when Trump lost his re-election campaign, a larger proportion than the general population of those people were military veterans, and they were largely white men, and they were a large proportion of them were in their 30s, still living with their parents because they couldn't afford a life of their own. So I think those economic conditions have resulted in a profound kind of moral injury, a real anger about why can't we have a decent life? Why can't we get ahead? So I have a friend, and I have to give credit to Joseph Winnicott Leiden, who sort of pointed me in this direction. He, you know, Joseph, he was a colleague of yours in graduate school. He also works on moral injury. He works for an organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups in the United States, the rise of fascist groups. And Joe has concluded, he teaches in our moral injury certificate program, by the way. He has concluded that hate groups in the United States are driven by moral injury. That is the underlying energy of anger and hate for others, and the bonding that they get from trusting each other as a tight group. That is the energy behind a lot of the hate groups in the United States. So I think that those are things that are important to keep in mind, and that these hate groups are basically the energy of Donald Trump's base, his voters. And I think his charisma, his ability to hold that base, it's about 35% of the American public that still supports him in that kind of way, that they're considered his Republican base. What he has, that's the charisma that holds them tight, is aggrieved victim anger. If you watch him speak, he just sort of pours out of him that aggrieved victim anger. So that's one form of moral injury I think is happening, right? That is part of the context politically that we're living in right now. The other part of it is now a whole other population, like those of us in Minnesota, are experiencing betrayal by our own government. We have a government now that is sending people in as militias and just doing horrible things that right now the organization most responsible for this horror is called the Immigration Customs Enforcement Group. ICE, ICE, that's their acronym, ICE for short. So you see all kinds of, if you've watched the news at all in the US, in Minnesota, you see out ICE, abolish ICE, no ICE. And because Minnesota right now is in the middle of deep cold winter, there are a lot of jokes about ice and ice. New York Times actually had a headline, Minnesota feeding ice, because the people are in sport. And so there are lots of memes of them slipping on the ice and falling and everybody laughing. But in any case, ICE is rounding up people randomly who are mostly brown and black or speak with an accent. They have violated so far about 4 constitutional amendments about due process, warrants for search and seizure, arrest of people. You need a warrant, a judge warrant. They just ignore all that. And part of the reason why is because they're basically being kind of paid as bounty hunters. So if they pick somebody up and arrest them, they get paid per person. It doesn't matter if the person's guilty or whatever. If they find a way to get you and arrest you and take you to the federal building to book you, they get paid. And so people like, I don't know if you saw the story about the little boy Liam and his dad who got picked up by ICE. They were legally in the United States, but they got picked up and sent to Texas. And a judge had to issue a ruling, like they had to do an emergency ruling to get them not to deport them from the United States, even though they were legally here. They're just one story. I know a family whose daughter worked as a public official in the Florida state government who was picked up by ICE, and 7 months after she was picked up, they still can't find her. She was legally here. So they're picking up citizens. If you say I'm a citizen, they don't care. They're picking up citizens. They're picking up anybody brown or black, anybody with an accent, any observers that get in their way. They don't want you there. They can pick you up and take you to the federal building. And even if they have to release you, you may be in that building all day trying to get released. You may be sent on a plane. 100 people a day fly out of the Minneapolis airport in shackles on a charter airline, and they're sent somewhere else. And they may not be doing anything wrong. And in fact, January 20th, in the Twin Cities, it's a big metro. It's a large-ish metro area. For cities like New York or Houston or LA were tiny. Like Minneapolis is less than 500,000 people, but the larger metro area is about 3 million. And on January 20th, 28 police chiefs from all the suburbs in the cities, including the chiefs of police of Minneapolis and St. Paul, held a press conference. 28 chiefs of police plus the head sheriff in Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is, had a press conference to complain about ICE. And what they said was the ways that they're stirring up protests and violence is making their job of policing and protecting the public harder, because they have their regular jobs to do, much less trying to help people who get screwed over, as it were, by ICE. But on top of that, and this is how shocking it is to me, they complained that off-duty police officers who are brown or black were being hassled by ICE. ICE is trying to pick up off-duty police officers that don't look white. This is sort of the police. They don't care. They don't care. So all of that has been happening, not just in Minnesota, but in Chicago and Portland and Washington, D.C. and other places. So we're not alone in this. But they decided to make us an example in Minnesota, overwhelming force. So they sent 2,000 agents in. I mean, Minneapolis has 600 police, right? Agents. So that suddenly 2,000 ICE agents came in and they wanted to show overwhelming force. And in that process, on January 6th, they murdered a white woman who was a poet and a mother, and an American citizen. When they wanted to, the justice, they didn't investigate her murder. And there are other people ISIS killed, but the video was so clear in this case that she was murdered, that she was not a danger to anybody and they shot her, that it sort of created a huge energy to do more in terms of what was happening with ICE. And then on the 24th of January, the day after a big strike day and 50,000 people reached in the city of Minneapolis, but the day after that, morning after at 9 a.m., they murdered another white person who was an ICU nurse working at the Minnesota Veterans Affairs Hospital. And then also in that case, the video makes it obvious that he wasn't doing anything to get shot, and that he was actually shot in the back and murdered. So if you've been watching BBC News, you know that the Epstein files dropped, right? It's like hard to avoid that's news here about the Epstein files. The irony of that is that a lot of us think that Donald Trump was using these action, like 3 or 4 terrible things a day, they call it flooding the zone with bad news, to distract people from wanting to see the Epstein files. So obviously what ICE is doing has gotten so bad, they dumped the Epstein files to bury the ICE story. So it's a very strange political time in the United States, but I think that the people who are, and there are literally thousands and tens of thousands of people in the Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota who have taken training to become observers, to keep their eyes on ICE and document what they're doing, because they're truly deeply angry about what's happening to their neighbors and to family members and to others that they read about in the papers, that they're trying to find a way to stop it. So that's another kind of moral injury. So moral injury necessarily a bad thing. It can create aggrieved victim anger, but it can also create citizen outrage to want to do something. So if you want to know how bad it is, the day after the second person, Alex Preddy, was killed, our Minneapolis emergency management director, a woman named Rachel Sayer, said this: "My background is in international humanitarian response in conflict zones in Yemen, Haiti, Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine. What I've seen here is what I've seen there. A powerful entity violently and intentionally terrorizing people, making them afraid to go outside so they can't earn a living, so that kids are forced out of school. People can't plan a single day of their lives because they don't know who was around the corner and if their family member or neighbor is about to be taken away." So those are the conditions under which a lot of the people right now in Minnesota and in other cities in the United States are living. That they're outraged, morally outraged by this, I think is actually a good thing. And it makes them want to do something. And they're not doing it out of hate for people, they're doing it out of love for their neighbor. And so I'm hopeful that something will change from all of this citizen activity that and the elections that will happen in November may actually turn the tide on this breakdown. It's really a major breakdown in American democracy because the president is doing whatever he wants to do. There are hundreds of court cases trying to stop him, but the courts take a very long time. And lots of people are being harmed and killed in the process. So I think that's enough.
It's a good opening salvo.
Yeah, okay.
So I'll just move the podium quickly so that the owl can capture us both.
Good. Is there some particular way we should sit?
I think
I think our heads are,
see us that way, yeah.
can you, okay, you can see us.
So there's so much that I was kind of jotting to come back to.
Yeah.
Maybe just to connect the dots in a couple ways to moral injury specifically. So one of the things Jonathan Shea, the American VA researcher who coined the term, and he was working with mostly Vietnam veterans in the US.
Who had mostly been a lot drafted,
Yes.
so they didn't want to be there.
So one of the things Jonathan Shea talks about in terms of moral injury is that it destroys the capacity, it says, for social trust. So when there's these institutions, the military or government, or certainly others, we see this in a religious sense, in the church and other capacities, there are these institutions that we trust to act in moral ways. In a lot of ways, we invest ourselves in. The military, by nature, kind of demands this investment of your own honor, your own sense of self into the ideal of it. So when things go wrong and we feel betrayed in those high stakes situations and we have so much of our agency and identity put into that, we feel that in a particularly unique way. Not only that, but it can destroy our capacity to trust those kind of institutions. So that's what it means. I think that idea of social trust becomes really difficult for us. How do we trust then again
You
in those
become
kind of
cynical.
institutions? Right.
Just become cynical.
To become moral, yeah, certainly a shorthand. I was searching for a passage from, just checking my own citations in a different article the other day, and I came across this passage. Jonathan Shea first writes the book Achilles in Vietnam in 94. And there's this prescient line in the back, and it's one of the first parts of his conclusion. He says, unhealed combat trauma diminishes democratic participation and can become a threat to democratic political institutions. Severe psychological injury originates in violation of trust and destroys the capacity for trust. When mistrust spreads widely and deeply, democratic civic discourse becomes impossible. I think that's again that idea that we have an investment in societies into the collective ways in which we live. So in the US, we were talking earlier in the day, Rita, about that being the Constitution, and a lot of these are conversations of generally and disagreements on political sides have reverted back to, right, but what does the Constitution say? How does it's interpreted through that lens? How is whatever's happening, particularly in the way the government acts, governed by that?
Well, it's especially bad when you have people who are running the institutions of government that don't know what the Constitution says.
Right, and it's interesting to see too, the conversation now is open in the United States in a place where I certainly haven't seen it before, where people are openly kind of having conversations that are about when those principles enshrined in the Constitution don't matter anymore. And that's kind of an area that that's new and somewhat disturbing in this. And so I wonder, just to kind of connect again, this is to what you were saying earlier, Rita, that there's a study here too at King's College London in 2022 that noted a profound connection between moral injury and radicalization. And what they found was morally injured individuals, there's a moral confusion about that develops. In that breach of social trust, I've put a lot in this institution, my society, my family, the people around me invest in this, and I felt that intense sense of betrayal as a result of that. And so the study out of KCL noted that basically those who had experienced profound moral injury were vulnerable to radicalization because radicalized or extremist groups give people exactly this. They give a firm identity. There's a firm sense of an in-group and an out-group. There's an unambiguous worldview put forth, an unambiguous moral sense of the world. In addition, one of the things that moral injury can do is diminish that sense of one's agency. Extremist groups are really good at saying, here's a purpose, here's a firm sense of agency.
Yeah,
Often as well, again, that tight-knit community that you mentioned.
yeah, well, and
the danger as
the
well.
loss of identity and life purpose, so then you get handed one that's really intense and furious.
Yeah, so I guess I wonder a little bit in that as well. We mentioned this, the KCL study focuses on extreme groups, and we talked about our friend Joe's work at the Southern Poverty Law Center. But I wonder if this works too in a lower intensity way, just as a general feeling of mistrust and perhaps an openness then to explore more radical
Yeah.
and different, be open to different ideologies that maybe in the past, particularly in the US,
We would be shocked by, yeah. No, I think that's true. For example, a thing surfaced during COVID that and I think it happens because people sort of feel helpless and they want something to hang on to. And so there was what happened during COVID was it surfaced that there was a fairly intense anti-vaccine culture in the United States that wasn't just religious evangelicals, although that was one of the population. In fact, my Aunt Vilma, who is a Pentecostal Puerto Rican, was told by her minister that if she got the COVID vaccine, she would die in 10 years. Where that came from, I don't know, but she was old, so I thought, why wouldn't you get it? You get 10 more years. But she really was intensely around that. But it was also sort of the new, what we used to call new age spiritual people that didn't have a religious affiliation, but they had this sense of spirituality, and so they distrusted some forms of science. And so that Mill Valley, California was one of those places where people were fighting vaccines that were required to send their kids to school and things. So when COVID hit, that suddenly became a shift in that community in Mill Valley, that people realized they needed to be vaccinated. So they were open to it, but the Christian evangelical community fought it and fought it and fought it. So that's just an example of it's just a strange thing that was already in the culture a little bit, but and now it's become a major problem in areas where people won't get vaccinated. They won't vaccinate their children for measles, which is one of the deadliest diseases there is.
I was just thinking, I wonder if that sense of moral confusion, the breakdown of social trust, in terms of not only obviously the government institutions that we trust to make decisions, but also just the ways in which we, in epistemological sense, how do we know things?
Well, it's true that the Trump was in power during COVID, and he also fed that distrust of Anthony Fauci and the people who were advocating for this miraculous vaccine that the Trump administration actually funded and produced that vaccine at lightning speed. Yeah, but then they undermined that multi-billion-dollar project by making people doubt whether it worked and recommending that people inject themselves with chlorine, which is not a very healthy thing to do, or use this horse medicine called ivermectin. They were throwing these strange things out about COVID, which disrupted the public's trust in a vaccine that clearly saved millions of people.
And I wonder, in the UK, it seems like a lot of, despite shifting political beliefs, and where you can have perhaps a broader even window of what's appropriate is opening up here as well, it seems like there's still a sense that it doesn't seem like there's quite the same amount of moral confusion around everything. And it seems like once you open up that box, everything becomes possible again. And that's what the damage to institutions is. It's the norms, it's the things that people take for granted that are practices that aren't solidly put in place, but actually require us all to buy into. It seems like there's a profound sense that what Shay's pointing to is, particularly among combat veterans who experience that in a really acute way, that's what's dangerous. It's just the inability to come together and trust relationally as well.
Yeah, well, I think there's the US is in some ways and contextually different from England, especially in terms of healthcare. But there's pockets of major distrust about institutions that just sort of operate in the US all the time. There's sort of hotbeds of, Waco, Texas, with the Brite Davidians, these religious sects and groups that don't trust the government. And I think that because US healthcare is a real disaster, actually. It's excellent if you're rich. That people relate to healthcare institutions in combative ways.
Mhm.
They don't, because you have to fight your insurance company to pay for things. And if you get sick, it can bankrupt your family. And so the healthcare itself is already sort of radioactive.
Mm.
And I think the COVID thing sort of just dropped into that mess, as a controversial issue also.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I've written about this in terms of moral injury. One of the things that, as a veteran myself, that resonated when I really started to look at the concept of moral injury after I left was that idea of loss of agency.
Yes.
There's a sense in which my actions don't really matter. The military often experiences this in terms of, describe it. Say I've invested so much into this thing, but come to realize how easily my agency is co-opted and led around because of that trust that I place.
Yeah.
It leads us to believe perhaps there is no real way that I can make a difference in the world. These institutions and governments and forces are really so much more powerful than I am. What is the point of doing this? And in terms of a threat to democratic institution that Jonathan Shea is naming, I wonder if that transcends directly into voting and doing things that have traditionally been pillars of obviously democratic process that are necessary. You need people to go and vote. You need people to trust that my vote will matter.
Yeah.
And that my participation in this will make a difference.
Yeah. And the US has had a very bad democracy its entire history. So the Constitution isn't actually very democratic. It stacks the deck for the southern states that were slave owning states, in the representational process. So the US Senate is not democratic. It's like one Senate vote in Wyoming counts 39 votes in California. That's pretty undemocratic. And that's how the president gets elected, is through the Electoral College, which combines the House of Representatives with those 100 senators. So Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the presidential election to Trump because it's not democratic in the US. And I think that creates a certain kind of disillusioned cynicism with the democratic process. We have some of the for a democracy, we have some of the lowest voter turnout rates in the world.
Mhm.
And Minnesota, yay, has the highest voter turnout. Usually it's number one for voter turnout in the US. So Minnesota's, we believe in democracy, even if it's not very good. It just, the state of Minnesota makes it easy to vote. But in other states, like especially in the South, they made it really hard to vote, especially for anyone who wasn't white.
Mhm.
So,
Or overseas.
Now they're trying to cancel people who don't live in, they live abroad or whatever. But so the US democracy itself was, I don't think, as sturdy as it is in other places sometimes. And it's always been kind of odd. And I have to say, if you study history at all, we've had some pretty bad presidents.
True. I wonder, we talk about a lot as well. Or I should say, we're painting moral injury as moral confusion, moral trust, and there's a way in which, if you listen to this conversation, you may be thinking moral injury, therefore, is a problem in and of itself in the way that morally injured persons see the world. And maybe I'm framing that perhaps so that I can switch that around in just a moment. And say,
good.
For example, that there's a scholar from the Netherlands named Tina Molendijk who does really interesting work in this. And one of the things she says that I really resonate with, even as a veteran, is that moral injury can't be treated as problematic or as pathologizing, like there's something wrong with this person. Rather, this person is a source of moral knowledge. What they've seen and the things they've done. Veterans often see the truth about war that often gets elided in political discourse. They see things that people don't want to talk about, the raw violence of it, and have to participate in that. And that's a source of moral knowledge about what's really happening. And it's important that that's protected as well. So I've painted it as moral injury leads people to be radicalized or disillusioned or anti-democratic, and that's not necessarily true at all.
That way.
Yes,
You break
it can,
that way,
certainly.
right? It's because it's a high risk thing. Rabbi David Blumenthal, who taught at Emory for a long time, says that, and he got very interested in moral injury. That's sort of, he moves into areas of human suffering that are interesting. He says moral injury is a sign of moral health. If something really is wrong, you ought to be upset about it.
Yeah, and I think that's that idea. There's an element of truth to it.
Yeah.
So even for people who, in the conversation about fascism and democracy, I mean, the people who are morally injured often in that process, they're pointing to a real problem. It's not that their disenfranchisement isn't real.
Economic inequality
Right.
is growing in the United States and has been growing since 1980 is true.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who are disenfranchised from the economic system.
And perhaps like veterans who realize the truth about war that often most people don't have to look at or have the privilege of ignoring and entertaining a discourse that doesn't deal with that hard reality. So too, perhaps to many people in a democratic process have the privilege of not engaging and dealing with that reality that many of those people that we might say encountering that moral knowledge there.
Like the 100 billionaires that are owning the government right now.
Right, right. But also just voters who, would consider themselves to be comfortable and participate in democracy regularly, but aren't that end of it or this end of it, but that don't encounter that.
Yeah, well, there's a I don't know if any of you saw the film The Zone of Interest, which is it Hess, Rudolf Hess's family?
Yes, he was the commandant.
He was one of the Nazi commandants of Auschwitz. And the film is astonishing because it depicts what a Jewish lawyer who escaped the Holocaust describes as a dual culture process that the Nazis used. Is how they succeeded is they had this brown shirt horrible group like ICE who were terrorizing Jews and collecting them, but then they ran the rest of society as if it were normal, and everybody and the Germans just were hidden. They hid the death camps and all, and so ordinary Germans didn't cotton on to what was going on for a long time. And the Zone of Interest has the family of Hess living a normal life with their garden and their children and their dinner parties in a house that's right next to Auschwitz, and the Auschwitz death camp is next door, and you can see the smoke rising and the noises from the fires and everything, but the family just operates as if nothing is happening. And I think that that's true economically in the US. You have class separations and divisions where people in the suburbs and in the middle class, and especially white suburbs, are just carrying on with life and going to their jobs, and they don't have to see what ICE is doing. And that there was actually a piece in the Atlantic that talked about that theory of the dual societies, that's what the US was living with right now. I'm not sure that's actually true.
Right.
Because I think that social media and other things didn't exist in Nazi Germany, and more people, that there are plenty, I mean, Alex Pretty was not somebody who he lived in a mixed neighborhood, but he was a nurse. And same with Renee Nicole Good. She had a nice car and a family and her children. And so I think more people are aware, and they're incredibly upset than that picture of the dual society paints. But it is also true that if you're well off, you can, or even just a little above the medium for middle class, that you can go about your daily life right now and maybe not pay much attention to what the government's doing.
Yeah, and that's where to me it relates so much to the veteran experience of where this comes from. Because in the United States, what is it, 1% of the population?
1% serves, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a way in which 99% could ignore that reality that veterans often have to live with, and I think that gap.
Yeah.
And one of the things we learned from veterans and applying it to this different context is certainly that gap is a huge part of the problem, that gap in knowledge, because from a veteran perspective, it creates that idea that there is no space for me to morally talk about this in conversation. There are no places where I could tell the truth about this and expect to be well received.
It just looks like you were from Mars.
Right, because that gap is just so huge in experience and what people expect that to have been like.
Yeah.
It's probably a good point too to say when we, the title of this and using the word fascism is provocative in one sense and definitely evokes things. And even as we're talking about this, the examples that we want to pull out are the worst possible manifestation of that on Earth historically in the Nazis. Fascism, and saying they're slipping into or having fascist moments or
Yeah.
fascist forces are at play isn't saying this is Nazi Germany.
No,
But it's
the parallel that, I mean, right now, the current government is using the Nazi playbook, right?
there are certain fascist,
Yeah.
there are certain ways in which you can see the similarities, particularly in a way it's not stepping away and rejecting some of those things that have traditionally been rejected, perhaps by American
Yeah.
political leaders.
This is a fact that during World War II, there were about a dozen Nazis that were in Congress, and they were getting speeches from Hitler's people and reading them into the congressional record of the US Congress. And they were being tried, and then the trial fell apart, and then at the end of the war, Truman didn't want to continue persecuting. He wanted the war to go away, the aftermath, to not persecute people.
Yeah.
And so, but Nazism has been around in the US for a long time.
Well, I wonder if that's the notion here, that moral injury and the links to radicalization, the work that Joe is doing, that we're talking about, that idea of failure to recognize those experiences of moral injured persons as moral knowledge, as Tina says. I
Yeah,
wonder if that's a huge part of this, because we have ways, and what we're pointing to is there's a lot of ways of rejecting those ideas. There's a lot of ways of weaponizing those ideas,
yeah.
but there's also healthy ways of engaging.
Well, I think
At the
that
same
recently the resistance in Minnesota is strong is we do have we don't have, in terms of numbers and percentages, as many immigrants as Florida or Texas or California. But we welcome the immigrants. I mean, the new mayor of St. Paul is from the Hmong Cambodian community. She's the first one in their community to be a mayor, but it's very cool that she is. Keith Ellison, who's African American and Muslim, is our attorney general. There's some things about Minnesota that are not as profoundly difficult for people of color to come in and be part of. But I think if you are a woman or a person of color in the United States, that the history of the United States is that we were not included in the democracy for a very long time, and we had to fight for it. But as recently as World War II, the president of the United States, Roosevelt, who everybody idolizes because he, set up Social Security and all that, he actually rescinded the citizenship rights of thousands of native-born or naturalized citizens and put them in concentration camps from the war just because they had Japanese ancestry. That happened in the United States. People were just imprisoned, thousands of people. First, they were put in horse stalls because they didn't have the camps ready. And then they got the camps ready and they moved them into like the middle of the Mojave Desert and up in Wyoming and places. And it mostly happened on the West Coast, which is where the largest numbers of them were, and also somewhat from Hawaii. But that was just the denial of the constitutional rights of citizens based on race. So the US has this history. I mean, slavery was the prime evil example of it, but it's not like the US has a clean history on any of this.
Mhm.
So those strands are still in American culture. They don't go away entirely.
So what do you think are, I think in that same sense, because certainly everybody's experiences are complex. I mean, race in the US, like we talked about, certainly plays a huge factor in, determining horizons and what's available and what choices and what opportunities one have. Certainly the experience is complex for all people and find themselves all over that spectrum. So,
Yeah.
and moral injury is certainly not exclusive to any one group
Yeah.
or another. Everybody's circumstances are complex. Some people and some people who traditionally we might think are disenfranchised often don't experience life that way.
Yeah.
Many people who we think are in different classes don't, or maybe more privileged ones also don't live and don't feel those pressures the same way. So, Vicky, maybe what are some helpful ways, if radicalization and extremist groups are negative ways of weaponizing moral injury or kind of addressing it. What do you
Well,
think are some really helpful ways of engaging moral
one of
injury?
the things that happened after the Japanese and what they call internment camps, they were basically concentration camps. One of the things that happened when the war ended was that a group of them they created organizations that defend human rights. So when 9/11 happened and all this anti-Muslim stuff started to surface in the US, it got really nasty. The first human rights organization to speak out on behalf of Muslims were Japanese Americans from the organizations they had. So you just have to be able to organize with people that you trust, right?
Mhm.
And I think that civil rights movement was another one where people trusted each other. I think what is happening in Minnesota right now is also something that happened that fueled the civil rights movement, which is that in the US, white labor unions in New York and things got things like vacation, 40-hour work week, paid leave, and all those things. So they actually worked really hard to organize against corporate, well, at that time they weren't corporate, but businesses that didn't have fair labor practices, and got legislation passed that actually gave people a better life. And they did that by organizing and strikes and things. So in the 1920s, some socialists who were labor union folks decided to create a training school for activists. And so it was called the Highlander School because it was in the mountains of Tennessee. And they trained Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Septima Clark. If you clock through a lot of the major civil rights leaders, they were all trained at the Highlander School. And in Minnesota, when we decided this general strike day on the 23rd of January, 700 businesses agreed to close. The AFL-CIO that represents a 1,000 unions plus 23 other unions all joined the strike. And so we brought 600 clergy in from outside Minnesota for a day of training on how to organize in their own communities, religious leaders. And we had 500 Minnesota clergy who were also trained. And that week, we all trained with the union people who do this kind of shut things down, picket, protest things. They have well-oiled machines that know how to do that. They trained us all for a day in which we shut down the airport and had 50,000 people march in downtown Minnesota. So I was part of this group of 98 local clergy. I'm a chaplain, not a minister of a church, but clergy who agreed, 98 of us, to get arrested at the airport because we wanted to make a moral statement as religious leaders about the injustices happening through that airport. And so I was in training for 4 days for several hours a day with union folks who were showing us how we were going to be in formation, how we were going to deal with the cold, and what we were going to do if we got arrested, and how to treat the police, and that they would know we were going to be there and all. So they did all the background work for us. So these are so this is one way you can use your moral injury, is to make a change because you don't like what's happening.
And I wonder, we've been moral injury discourse, inherently, and, I could have said this at the outset, but assuming it's implied in the title, has political dimensions that are unavoidable when you're talking about social trust, institutions like that. So, and certainly this falls on particular, those ideas fall on particular groups at the moment in the United States, but lest this be construed as an entirely partisan issue, one of the things that always struck me about moral injury is that in the United States military, for example, training, there's a theory, US Army psychiatrist named Dave Grossman posits this theory that we don't actually want to kill other human beings. We actually find it immensely difficult because we have an evolutionary kind of psychological block against doing it. And it makes sense if you think about it from a purely Darwinian perspective. A species that wipes out its own is probably not going to be advantaged in that sense. It has threats from other species and it's from within. That's going to be a problem. So he says, we really struggle with this. one of the things he posits is that, and you can actually see this in militaries, there have been studies done that show even troops in combat often are not pre-World War II and into World War II, were not actively firing at the enemy with the intention of killing them. Often they were going through the motions, firing over their heads, intentionally missing, doing things that they would be perceived as doing that, but know they could save their conscience and not actually have to kill other human beings. So this kind of gets revamped in the 60s and 70s in the run-up to Vietnam. Military in the US particularly notices this, and Grossman's theory is that they employ deliberate dehumanizing rhetoric in order to kind of get around that injunction. So they train people intentionally with ethnic slurs, portray the enemy as the ultimate other, nothing like us, entirely different, and that makes it easier for them to do that. But one of the things they find is that the haunting aspect of killing for many people who live in that, trained that, who internalize that ideology, that when they do so, they find out actually that person was just like me.
Yeah.
And they're another human being, and moral injury in the core of it is essentially that recognition of the humanity of others.
Uh-huh.
And I think in the US sometimes even what's interesting, I've always found fascinating, is that idea that perhaps it's military members and morally injured veterans who carry to the rest of the populace the rejection of dehumanizing rhetoric.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I've always thought that that idea of dehumanization versus moral injury and pointing to the unavoidable truth of our common humanity is a real tension that
And I
exists.
think that's a tension right now with the ICE agents, because
Oh, what's the CO2
We
lighting
need
off
to
the window?
open the windows if you don't mind.
Okay.
all right, good, we're not gonna. One of the things around that is the ICE agents. They're dehumanizing themselves by wearing masks and full combat gear. They come in with machine guns. I mean, it's really awful. So they're not like people. They're like these automatons. I mean, they're being, and they treat people really badly. And I think the uniform helps that, right? So, but the fact is that the recruitment, they got huge amounts of extra money from the new budget that the Trump administration finally got through Congress. So they've been recruiting heavily using images of 1950s white families at dinner about making America great again. So they're using racism and other things to recruit people for ICE. And they don't have to have a college degree or anything. So a lot of, and a high school degree in the United States does not get you a decent paying job, but the ICE pays really well. It's a federal agent job. And so they've been recruiting like crazy from areas where they think they're going to get people to come in. Half the people, this is some reporter that discovered this, about half the people they've recruited that can't pass the physical. And then the other half get only 47, Trump is president number 47. So they only get 47 days of training, which I think I used to train people for months because they don't understand the Constitution. There's a lot of things they don't know, but they get 47 days of training, and then they have to take an exam, which is an open book exam, and half of them failed the exam. So that tells you something about the people who are enlisting in ICE that want a high paying job. So they're people who just need money. I mean, it's like, so they're motivated, and then the bounty is extra income. But then when all of the mess happened and the murders happened and Congress wanted, the Democrats and some Republicans started worrying about ICE, and there's talk of changing or even, killing the funding for ICE, and all of that started to happen actually in Congress because of the news stories about the videos and the murders. So then there was a discussion about, well, maybe we should make sure that they act like actual federal agents. They show their faces, no masks, no machine guns. They, just like a police person, which, in any case, it turns out that a lot of them would quit if they had to take their masks off.
Hmm.
They don't like it. Supposedly it was because they were afraid they'd be identified and their addresses would be, that sort of, like their security would be threatened. But there are people that think maybe now it's actually also because they don't like what they have to do and they don't want to take the mask. I think it's really easy to dehumanize the ICE agents as well.
Yeah,
Right,
certainly.
and part of it is they want you to, the part of the overwhelming force is they wanted you to be afraid. So the people who don't act afraid really annoy them.
And there does seem like there's a sense in which, again, what moral injury perhaps teaches is that recognized humanity is the way we have productive conversations.
Yes.
On both sides.
And on both sides.
Right, refusing to dehumanize the other is a key
Yeah.
aspect of being able to witness to both that moral knowledge,
Mhm.
but in a way that's helpful. Let me just ask one other question, Rita, and I want to open it up for folks who've listened really patiently in the room and as well as online to get involved in the conversation. What measures did you use to stay safe while you were protesting, while you're engaging? Because that's important to probably put out there before we.
I am not one of the protesters. I'm not showing up to these places and yelling at the agents. It's not been violent. With that, the union training is always nonviolence, and they learned from the George Floyd uprising 5 years ago. Community organizers and clergy realized they need to be better organized at those places to keep them nonviolent. So Minneapolis has been ready for this, right? There's organizations that were formed 5 years ago. So there's emphasis on nonviolence, but they yell at them and they try to, like humiliate them or say, I'm not afraid of you or whatever. And then they get tear gassed. And so the church I attend, the building is now a warming center because it was near the Alex Preddy murder. We started that day becoming a warming center. We were giving gas masks away. They're $35 each, but we've had hundreds of them go out the door. So we're protecting the protesters as much as we can. We give them kits for how to deal with tear gas and say, be a street medic, this is how you do it. So we've been trying to keep the protesters as safe as possible. I'm 75 years old, so I don't think I'm very much use out there. So I worked the warming station for 4 hours on several shifts of 4 hours, and talked to them and provided spiritual care also, and food and warm drink. But so we're trying to keep the protesters as safe as possible. The arrest at the airport was highly orchestrated, and I never felt in any risk or anything beyond an uncomfortable day in a jail cell, maybe. So I've had other arrests for demonstrations that were much worse, not worse, but I did have to spend a day in jail. And in the case in Minnesota, we were just put on a heated bus. Yay! It was minus 28 Celsius or something that day. So when they arrested us, they put us on heated buses, and 98 of us took a long time to arrest, one at a time and book. So we were in those heated buses for a while. But that was it. And then we were released. They were actually, this was the airport police. They were actually quite kind to us because I don't think they like us either. But, and then after the Alex Preddy murder, the ICE was there for a while, messing up the murder scene, so a good investigation can't be done. And then eventually the governor called in the National Guard to secure the site so that the state investigators could get in there. And so we didn't know when that happened, when the governor had called in the National Guard, we didn't know if that meant that Trump might call it the Insurrection Act. And there was an army unit of 1,500 army soldiers in Alaska that were cold trained. The ICE isn't cold trained. So they were, if the insurrection act happened, that he would call that army unit down. And so we didn't know if the Minnesota National Guard could be nationalized by Trump in that context, or whether they would hold the line and protect Minnesotans and we would have a civil war. So that was the most nervous we all were about what was going to happen around the Alex Petty murder. So Trump caved. He actually fired the guy that organized it, that policy, and nothing's any better, but the main person got fired. I think that was a token gesture to try to smooth it over because he was getting pushback from Republicans in Congress. So so I never really felt a particular risk myself. But I'm also, I live with my brother and sister and have 3 cats, but if anything happened to me, the cats are fine, my brother and sister would be fine. I wouldn't be there, but it's not like it's like people who have children, who have aging parents, people they're taking care of, medical workers, I think they shouldn't be doing dangerous kinds of things in protest actions. But they're
Good safeguarding.
I think people need to weigh risk for what they need to sustain. If there's a lot of people dependent on them, I don't think they should be trying to get arrested or any of those sorts of things. So what you can't see in the news is literally tens of thousands of Minnesotans are completely invisible and quietly doing the work. So one organization, that's Spanish-speaking organization, has trained 24,000 people on how to be legal observers of ICE activity, how to use your phone, how to record what's going on, how to report. That's just one organization. And they're just neighborhoods that are organized. Frogtown, which is the big Hmong immigrant neighborhood in St. Paul, it's the largest Hmong community in the country. They have a signal group where you volunteer to be a patrol person that day. They take 1,000 people a day. That signal group fills up pretty fast in the morning. They have at least 1,000 people watching ICE in that neighborhood every day. You know who the hell they are. It's a signal. It's a secret thing, right? So there's a bunch of that. There's just a ton of that. And then there are clergy and churches being warming centers. I've worked with people on shifts that don't want to be identified. So they're just, it's a lot of underground stuff. It's just normal people being good to their neighbors. And they're not taking the same risks as, but it's still a risk. In fact, one of the things that people are doing, because there are people afraid to leave their homes because their schools are being raided or the workplaces are being raided. ICE has gone into a restaurant to eat and then arrested the employees. That's how bad they are. So there are people who don't leave their homes. They can't leave their homes. They don't feel safe. So we have hundreds of thousands of people, I think, delivering food, collecting it, buying it, delivering it. And then when ICE started following white people with grocery bags, they had to memorize addresses so ICE wouldn't know what they were. They couldn't put them in their phone or get a piece of paper. They had to memorize the address so that ICE wouldn't be able to find those people. So there's that.
Fair enough. Let me open up. I should make a note as we move to questions. We want to make sure we stop our recording so that we can facilitate an open conversation. Everyone in the room and those of you online should know questions will not be part of the recording that we'll put up later on our website. So